Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Disclosure Team YouTube channel. That was the trailer for our upcoming documentary series, Phenomenology, which airs on May the 1st. You can go and subscribe now to the dedicated Phenomenology YouTube channel. We've already got the trailer up there. We've also got a rough cuts edit just to give you guys like an idea of the tone of how the series is going to look. But for now, we're here to talk about Canada and UFOs and Canada. So I'm going to waste no more time. I'm going to bring in the panel for tonight, starting with Miss Chrissy Newton. Chrissy, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm really good. Yeah, good to see you too. Thank you so much for joining me.
For sure.
And next up, we have Mr. Daniel Otis. Daniel, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, Vinny.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. I really appreciate you joining us. And finally, Mr. Victor Viggiani. Victor, it's good to see you.
Great to be with you, Vinny.
Thank you so much. This is a great panel. I'm really excited to discuss Canada. Canada being one of the sort of Five Eyes Alliance, very similar to what it's like over here in the UK. I've seen in some of the research I've been doing in preparation for this, I've seen some similarities between the way that the Canadian government and the UK government have handled the subject over the years. And we'll get into that a little bit, as well as some of the more recent news that especially, Daniel, you've been involved in. But to start with, I wanted to start with you, actually, Daniel, because you're a journalist who covers this subject. And I was just interested to see if you've encountered much of the stigma and taboo surrounding the subject since you've been writing about it.
Well, the short answer is certainly yes. You know, I've been working as a journalist for over a decade for a lot of major publications here in Canada and elsewhere. And over the past year, almost, I've been writing about UFOs for Vice. When I first started talking to my colleagues about, this new interest of mine, it was definitely a lot of smirks and eye rolling. But when the access to information requests started coming in and I could hold up Canadian Air Force documents that outline, what a commercial pilot, just saw, then I noticed perspectives started to change. I think the stigma still exists. If you look at mainstream media in Canada, for the most part, Canadian publications only are really covering the subject unless it's an American development, the big ODNI reports or stuff like that. When it comes to Canadian data and Canadian developments, for some reason, Canadian media more or less, steers clear from it, with the exception of me and a very small number of other people. I'd say it's I don't know what the media is like in in Europe and the UK. Canada's not what it's like in the United States, where you see a growing mainstream acceptance, where CNN, New York Times, etc. are doing stories on the subject. Canada, it's early days yet, but hopefully the sort of work I'm doing will help thaw that media climate a bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm going to second that.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
No, I was just going to second what Daniel said. He's doing fabulous work. We don't, as a Canadian that works with media all the time, I don't see it as well. And, we have a story that breaks, and then 2 weeks later, if it's a UFO story, Daniel's already covered it before for Vice, but then we see other mainstream media in Canada catch up 2 weeks later and are just kind of put together the parts and the pieces. And it's unfortunate. And also American media works better with other media than Canadian media. Canadian media like CBC, for example, won't work with other outlets. They won't work with certain journalists because they want to obviously find their own stories, but they have, there are rules against that. So it's unfortunate just the way that media is disseminated here, especially around UFOs.
Yeah, over here we have sort of two types of media. We have the tabloids who cover it regularly, but it's all alien hunters and that kind of really trashy stories on it. And then every now and again we have they cover big things like Daniel mentioned, the ODNI report. But yeah, it's mainly the tabloids, unfortunately. Victor, what about yourself? Have you come across any of the stigma and taboo, whether recently or over the years, and have you seen it change in time?
Well, over the past 45 years that I've been covering this issue, it's pretty much exactly the way I guess Daniel described it here in Canada. There's a real sick duplicity with which Canadian media, particularly the CBC, has chosen to deal with this issue. I put on the plate of the CBC a number of issues over the years, only one of which got any kind of massive coverage by the CBC on The Current by Anna Maria Tremonti when the UAP issue hit its peak in 2017, and that's a story for another time. But Anna Maria Tremonti went after it in within days of 2017, December 17th. And she covered it very, very well. She asked the Canadian Air Force to be part of it. They did not consent to it. They sent a nice letter to her, a letter of denial that we didn't cover this stuff. So that kind of duplicity is present within just about every aspect of the Canadian media. Now, there is the odd individual journalist like Mike Jolet at Global News who did some coverage of it with me. But then again, it rises up the flagpole, and then within days, it's taken down. So it's really unfortunate that that's the way the Canadian media it covers things. It's almost like they're waiting for something really big to happen, and when it does happen, they approach it with kid gloves and then just drop it the next day. So, and in conversation with the people at The Current, one of the producers, I asked him that question: "What's the big deal?" And he said, "It's just not news in our book that we can sustain. We just can't sustain that kind of information over the long period of time." Meanwhile, it's the biggest issue facing the human family, and the biggest news organization in Canada finds it impossible to cover that kind of information. So I look at it as, I wouldn't call it a secrecy or anything, or government control. I just think it's, I call it just sick duplicity on their part, not to realize that this is in fact the biggest story facing the human family.
Yeah, and I see the same thing on the press release side when I'm sending stuff out on the debrief end. I see that Canadian media is reading the stuff that we're breaking in science, tech, in UFOs. I know that they're reading our press releases, but I know that it's not getting disseminated through. And we're pitching it too. But I see BBC is more likely to come back, and for sure, American media is more than likely to talk about it in all different facets. But the way that they tell the stories are different too. American stories versus Canadian stories on the topic are a different way they cover it as well. So,
do you think it might be the sort of higher ups in these media companies that stop it in its tracks? Because I'd imagine some of the younger journalists probably want to start covering it. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's it's butting up against individual perspectives. I'm not going to give specific examples, but I've been working for mainstream media outlets for years, and recently I have spoken to editors in different places about the subject, and it's very hard to, we're still dealing with the question. I'm still dealing with the question, is this stuff real? You know what I mean? For anyone who digs deep into the topic, the validity of the data, speaks for itself, right? Once you dive into it, there are cases of genuine unidentified aerial objects being seen. But I think for people who aren't initiated, and because it's not so widespread in Canadian media, I'm still grappling with that question I thought was over. Do UFOs exist? Do UAP exist? When the real question is, what are they, right? And yeah, so it's higher ups, it's individuals, it's just the message that's been put out by outlets like the New York Times just hasn't really filtered into the psyche here, I feel.
Yeah, and you do have a hierarchy. There are, you work with journalists for sure that are freelancing. You work with journalists that are staff writers. You're working with senior producers, associate producers. There's a whole hierarchy that goes up, because in the past, not even just UFOs, I've pitched a story and then we've, and it's only happened, I think, twice in my career of like 12 years, where I've had two stories just stopped. We were supposed to go that morning and do a piece in the studio, and they end up just gone to the heads, and the heads were like, no, we're not doing it. So it does happen. It's possible. Do I know the reasons why? No. For UFOs, I've never seen that myself, but I think it's just a topic that Canada is not very well versed in. And there's only so many of us too that talk about the subject as well, and are maybe a little more deeper than the average journalist. But I think that will change. We're seeing that American media is picking up, and they're creating like their own UFO kind of divisions within news networks and talking about it more. So that will start to trickle up here too. And they'll probably start looking at, like, honestly, Daniel Otis is like, should be the forefront right now a little bit, to be honest. I'm like, and looking at that and taking that person and taking Daniel and growing it even more. But I think we'll see that, maybe in the years to come, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. So,
yeah. I mean, over the years, I'm just going to go back a little bit historically when it comes to the government in Canada and UFOs. I think they've been investigating UFOs, I think at least from 1950 to about 1955 across multiple departments and agencies. I think Project Magnet and Project Second Story, but then it kind of seems to trail off and you don't see as much. And it kind of reminds me again of what's happening here in the UK. But do you think the government are still investigating it in Canada? Has anyone come across anything or spoken to anyone that gives that impression? It just seems to have gone dark.
I think you need to draw a line between investigating and documenting. There's active Canadian procedures for aviation, for example, that have been on the books for years now. If you are a commercial pilot, it says if you see a quote unidentified flying object, this is how you file your report. Canada has been actively documenting cases for decades, from the dawn of the Cold War in the early 1950s up until today. But any sort of official efforts to investigate cases seem to have ended, around, it's hard to say, about around in the 1990s. We have something called the National Research Council of Canada. It's a federal research body. They were collecting reports from the military, the police, etc., up until the mid-90s. And that's when I think official interest petered out. But that being said, the procedures to document cases still exist with the military and with aviation authorities. Those reports still come in. And in cases where there's a clear regulatory or defense nexus, they are investigated. For example, there was a case of a flight over Lake Ontario near Toronto here in 2016 that took an evasive maneuver to avoid something. Because flight attendants were injured during the evasive maneuver, there was a bit of an investigation, because there was something to follow up on a regulatory perspective. Another example, I've found a few cases where unidentified objects have been picked up on military NORAD radar, unidentified objects approaching North America. And in those cases, there was some follow-up and investigation. But for 99% of the cases, even if it's, a Air Canada pilot, for example, seeing something incredibly odd, there's not going to be an investigation unless there's a clear safety or security nexus. I think that in the US, everything is seen under the lens of national security, whereas in Canada, it has to, show to be a known incredible threat for that investigation to happen.
Yeah. And Victor, I just mentioned a couple of the old cases, and it seemed at the time in the sort of 50s and 60s that the government did conclude that the phenomena did not lend itself to a scientific method of investigation. In your research, have you come across things that really go against that statement?
Well, I think once you begin injecting the idea of science into this whole thing, science on this issue does not know what's asked from page one, as far as I'm concerned. Science has a certain way of looking at everything, and it looks specifically at data. This is not about data at all. This is about the human experience of witnesses throughout the ages. This goes back historically in time, as far as we can even imagine. And what we're dealing with since 1952, back in 1947, is a minute particle of this whole issue. And I think that's why the media in general and science in general refuses to really look at the overall drastic implications of talking about this in a serious manner. And the microcosm, or the speck in the I guess in the myopic view of media since 1947, has really held us back to understand the whole I guess global and galactic implications of this since 1200, 1500, maybe even longer, years long. That's something that's never ever discussed about this. To look at the current data, you're only looking at a pinhole. You're looking at a small pinhole through which you can look at the data. We need to widen that pinhole and make it more accessible to everyone with respect to the huge amount of information that's available. And we're just not looking at that. So, looking at one investigation looking at an incident really doesn't give you a flavor of what this issue is really all about with respect to how the entire human family is looking at it. And Canada is only part of it, of course, but Canada has its own myopic way of looking at it, which does not help at all. So there's a bigger issue here. There's a much bigger issue.
Yeah. Do you think sometimes witness testimony and individual sightings that doesn't have any sort of data to back them up, do you think they just get swept under the rug because they don't have that additional data?
Of course, an individual sighting really means nothing. You can list them all. We've all looked at those kinds of sightings, but in fact of the matter, with one individual witness sighting, we really don't look at the entirety of it. So it's, once again, we go back to the pinhole analogy that I looked at.
Yeah. So what do you think the best way would be to expand those horizons?
For me, you're asking me that? How?
For anybody, if you have to advise anybody.
I have my own very strong views on that. But
Victor, what you're talking about isn't really in the realm of news media. You're talking about a scope that's better situated for the academic environment, for historians. I mean, news media, regardless of the subject, is concerned with like current events, and I think at least what I'm trying to do in some stories is, show the contemporary cases and the contemporary procedures, and then show, the historical continuity insofar as the document record allows, which is to the dawn of the Cold War. As you say, people have been experiencing things like this, for much longer than that. But, it's so, if you're going to, gain mainstream acceptance of the veracity of this topic, you have to have whatever shred of verifiable, supporting data you can produce. You're dealing with an audience that fundamentally doesn't believe in the validity of what you're presenting with them. So, at least in my perspective, I'm trying to present it, in the sort of most clearest verifiable way. If I mention a case, every story has a PDF attached with all of the source material, for example. Which you're talking about is valid, and there are fascinating accounts in the historical record. I just don't know how one could present those within the medium of news media.
I really don't think it's the individual cases that I'm alerting to. I think what I'm talking about is the larger implications of what this phenomenon is all about. And what I think media is most afraid of, first of all, is the level of secrecy that they might discover about this over the past 75 years. That's the first thing. And once that's uncovered, or at least put into the daylight, we might be able to move along to the next issue. And the next issue is the fact that we're being engaged by off-world civilizations. That's been proven time and time again. And the third thing is how these off-world civilizations are getting here. What kinds of technologies are they using to pilot these, whatever these craft are, whatever they might be, and wherever they're from? As soon as we begin to engage that kind of conversation, you completely change the narrative.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, Victor. I'm like, I think with just where we stand in news media, and that's why we're having trouble getting through, is because we also, first of all, need to get better journalists in this. Like Daniel Otis is one, and we only have a few, especially in Canada. But even journalists around the world, they're learning about this beat, and it's more than 75 years now. Oh, there goes my light. I knew that was going to happen. Vinny and I were just talking about it before we went on. And so I think we've had like 75 years of this where we haven't had proper journalism, where we've had, more fringe journalists come in and talk about this and know more. So I think we need to start at like getting journalists that actually understand and have a good understanding of what has happened throughout, along with us, like pulling apart this onion and layers of things that we're just finding out now. So we need to start there, and then we start moving into bigger stories and then asking better questions, because I think our journalists now are just kind of doing the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Most of them aren't getting into the nitty gritty because they don't know, because there's so much information. And there's new information coming out daily now. So I think what they need to do is start finding and cultivating people, or just groups of people, or going to more fringe people that have a better understanding. And journalists are doing that now more than ever. But I think that's where we need to start. And then we start moving into bigger subjects.
To what you're saying, Chrissy, I think that the UFO research community, or UAP research community, over the past 35 to 40 years, has done the work the media should have been doing back in 1955. We've done it. All that work has been done. All of the experts that have delved into this over the past 75 years have done the work, but it's quite clear journalists have just ignored the information. So if you want to start now, you're really starting at a bad place. You got to go back further than that to realize that the work has already been done for them. All they have to do is look at the information to start. You don't start now. You look back at what's already been done. And that really is a real crime of this whole thing. People are ignoring the information, ignoring the technologies, ignoring the global implications of this. So, if we're just starting from square one and getting people aware now, we're really starting off at a disadvantage. So I would really encourage any journalists that are worth their salt to look at what we've already done, what the UFO Research Committee has done over the past 70 years, and plug into it and bring that forward.
I think, sorry, Dane, go on.
No, I just quickly, I think one has to present a perspective, Victor. And I think, were I, for example, to attempt to write a mainstream news story on, experiencers, it's probably likely the end of my ability to continue writing for these types of outlets. I think what's important, instead of bringing people to your conclusions, is to impress upon them the fact that there's a mystery and that it's alive and well on this planet. I think that is the step we need to be taking now as communicators of the subject, and particularly in a country where acceptance of the veracity of the subject is still in its infancy. It's a big enough job to impress upon people through official documents, for example, that there is a mystery on this planet. And I think you can potentially do a disservice to communicating the message if you bring people to conclusions who are, who haven't absorbed any of this material to begin with.
No, I completely disagree with you. I think I agree that by mentioning experiencers, we'd be moving too fast. I completely agree with you there. However, this information that's been coming forward for the past 75 years journalistically, it's all there. It's all there. It's not something that's a mystery. It's the information, the investigation has already been done. It's just that good journalism has refused to look at it. And it's nothing new. It's not very much different than what we're dealing with right now. But the thing is right now is that it seems to be almost being framed as a new issue. Mm-hmm. And that's the big problem that I have. This is not a new issue. This is an issue that's been with humanity for a long time. Now, how you approach it journalistically, that's going to be a very delicate and diplomatic thing that you as a journalist have to do. But you do not start from the very beginning. You have to look at all of the work and all of the political work that's been done, all of the scientific work that's been done, and bring people forward to look at the information that we have already without starting from page one. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think we're all kind of saying the same thing, to be honest, in certain ways. Maybe not agreeing on the initial topic. If experiencers, let's just leave that out for now. But I think we all probably agree that there has to be some understanding of back history about the topic to move forward to get better journalism. And I'm hoping that we're going to move that way. I'm hoping that media is going to go that way across, around the world, to be honest, not just Canada and not the States. So I think that's a first start. And then education, let's just use from past education to recent. And then also we have to be mindful of who's telling those stories, because there's a lot of people telling UFO stories and a whole bunch of different groups of people telling UFO stories. So we have to remind who those people are, if they're the Stephen Greers, if they, are the George Knapps, who are all these groups of people, and what are their backgrounds and what are their contributions to this too. So I think there's more than we just have to get it out there and get the history out there. It's we have to do a lot of back audits of what we're doing in the stories that we're properly telling, and then bringing science in to help prove that narrative along to the average person. That's what? UFOs exist? There are a lot of those people still. And so we need to focus on those people, not so much us, I think, because the group of people that like UFOs are always going to push for more conversations and better conversations. I think it's how do we focus on the average person that doesn't know anything about UFOs or what is going on and thinks that it's all these other things, or is confused because they watch Ancient Aliens all the time and they're maybe not reading political news. No offense, Ancient Aliens, no offense, Giorgio. But I think there is, because they're watching entertainment and all this paranormal stuff, and they're going, oh, that's what this is, when there's actually more than that. And we all know that here as a group. So I think we need to nip entertainment in the butt where it needs to push them forward to tell better stories that are real and not so hyper, entertainment based, and then pushing news media to look at doing back audits of understanding the history and getting better journalists on the beat. And I think we all would agree with that, I hope. And I think we're in a better position moving forward. And I'm just obviously now thankful that major media is covering it, but I'm only going to be thankful for so long until they decide to start having more coverage about it. And then we're going to start.
That's exactly where I'm at, Chrissy.
Yeah.
If you look at how, for example, I divide things in a very definitive line. 2017 for me was a bookmark in history.
Yeah.
And the reason it was a bookmark is because the New York Times decided to do something. And I spoke to Ralph Blumenthal about this. And I said, you and Leslie Kane and Helena Cooper were sitting in an editorial room at the New York Times. And they brought all of the information forward about the Pentagon program to investigate the UFOs. They had it all very neatly packaged. And they had to make a decision to do something. And the New York Times made a very, very good decision to say, let's run with it. Okay. So the New York Times ran with the issue in very, very much the same way as the Washington Post did with Watergate. Okay. Big story, huge story. Pentagon involved in UFO research, huge story. And the same thing the New York Times did with the Pentagon Papers, huge story. Look at where Watergate went and look at the results of that. Look at where the Pentagon went and where that landed up. Okay, two huge, massive stories. Look at how the UFO issue was treated after 2017. It went up the flagpole. They did a great job, and that was it. So looking at the comparison of the two stories with the UFO issue, there was absolutely no comparison globally with respect to the impact of this. This should have been carried on much further by the mainstream media in the United States and globally too, but it wasn't. So the question is, why not? That's the question that we have to deal with.
Yeah, the thing is, we noticed last year, 2021, in the build-up to the preliminary assessment from the DoD, that there was 3 to 5 mainstream articles daily. I couldn't keep up with it, trying to share things across all my social medias. But then after the assessment came out, we had that huge dip where nothing seemed to happen, and mainstream media went silent as well. And so do you feel they should carry on investigating and keeping the story going? Or
the thing is, and pardon me for speaking out of turn, but the way it's been handled, it's just another form of the cover-up. It's mutated into another form of duplicity. And why? What's the reason behind it? That's the question I'd like to talk about.
Well,
Publicly.
I think you get ebbs and flow. Yeah, I think you get ebbs and flows with media, right? And it's changing so fast. Like the media landscape now and the media cycle is so quick. And like, Dan, you know this as well. Like you're in one day, you're out the other, right? And so I think we had a lot of other stories going on, it's with COVID and everything else that was happening around that, the news media can only cover so much. And so there is, and I'm not, giving them any kind of like credit in that way. For sure, I would like more, but I do understand the news cycle, that it doesn't always work that way. I think my challenge so much, to be honest, and I don't think it is how they're telling the stories. We look at, like, for example, with the New York Times, and there was a mistake in that, which, Leslie and Ralph didn't, Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Keane didn't actually know at that point that ATIP was actually OSAP. Right. And the funding was different. And we learned that in George Knapp's book, skinwalkers at the Pentagon, that came forward, that information wasn't properly disseminated. So when that article broke, it wasn't actually fully factual, which we find out later on, and that's going to keep happening. So I think as we start moving and evolving, news media is going to grow through all of this, and we have to start asking them to ask better questions and to cover it. But we're going to have to get used to these ebbs and flows, because they're not always going to tell the subject, and they might not always tell it the right way. For example, when we did our piece with The Hill that came out, where Christopher Mellon wrote for us and did an opinion piece, The Hill did some work with us in releasing that story, and I can talk about that. And what they did was they released it with us, and we did an interview with Chris based on the article that we had as well. But then the next story that came out, which they ended up putting on their YouTube page, was saying that the alien hypothesis was the correct, and that it was aliens. So they used a headline. The Hill ended up using a tabloid headline to push that forward, which isn't the story we were telling. We were telling the story is that the Air Force has gone AWOL on the entire UFO issue. But what they did was take a piece from Christopher Mellon that said that one of the hypothesis that might be somewhat correct is the alien one. But there's also many of them. Yeah. There's tons of them. That's just not the one that we know of. But they decided to take that, use it, and to get hits, and to, what bleeds leads concept. And so they spun it. And I know they spun it. And that wasn't there's nothing we could do about that with what we were giving them. That's what they decided to do in their editor room when they pushed it to YouTube. When they pushed it on their website, when they did a piece with an article, it ended up not being that headline, it being another one. So right there is an example of how media likes to turn things around themselves and create other narratives too, right? So I think we need to get better at us telling the story to media and making sure that we're like, hey, that's actually not what we said, and that needs to be corrected so that doesn't happen, along with then understand that we need to keep educating them. So, end thought.
No, I love that, actually. I think some of the people in the live chat are like, go Chrissy. That was brilliant. Yeah. Now, one thing that kind of did hit the mainstream a few years back now was when former Defense Minister Paul Hellyer sort of came out and started talking about the UFO subject with some quite bold claims as well. Victor, if you'd like to, if you could tell everyone a bit about Paul Hellyer and what he represented,
Well, essentially, it's people might have heard the story before, but in doing the radio program Strange Days Indeed with Errol Bruce Knapp, I guess it was probably, I did 15 years with the program, but we got a call one night in, I think it was 2005, the year that we were planning the symposium at the University of Toronto, from someone saying, you've got to talk to Paul Hellyer. And at the time, I knew Paul Hellyer, but I had no idea he had any interest at all in the UFO issue, which he didn't really at the time. So I called Paul and I said, we're having a symposium. Why don't you come forward and talk to us about it? This is the Reader's Digest version of it. And he said, no, I couldn't do that. So I said, okay, I'll call you back in a week or so. Once you finish reading the book that you've got there, the day after Roswell, you might change your mind. So about 2 weeks went by, and I called him again. He said, yes, I'll do it. So he came forward at the University of Toronto before 500 people in the media. And he was the first Minister of Cabinet rank to come forward demanding that the Canadian government actually make the UFO issue something of a priority, which they never really did. So he just kept on investigating things and bringing things forward over the years until he passed away just last August. So he was really someone who raised the specter of this within the Canadian community in a way that no one else has. And Paul and I worked on different aspects of it. We worked with different media. He had interviews globally. So he was someone who really, really went out on a limb. And Paul was he's a daredevil in a lot of ways. He's someone who really took chances on everything. And in doing so, he got a lot of flack from it. A lot of flack from his colleagues, from his political colleagues, but he didn't care. He didn't care one way or another, but he wanted the truth to come out, that we are in fact being, not just UFOs are real. He said that UFOs are as real as the airplanes that fly over your head. But he went on later on to make it very, very clear that we are being engaged by off-world civilizations. Case in point, there was no doubt in his mind, and many other people that he spoke to behind the scenes, that this in fact was correct. So he really raised the bar in Canada. But unfortunately, times pass, people pass, and the message gets dwarfed into a whole of secrecy, or whatever you want to call it. And that's where we're at right now. As big as his contribution was, it somehow has been laid by the wayside. But it won't stay there for long, though.
Yeah, hopefully, his legacy will continue, and it certainly won't be forgotten, because
for sure.
He deserves the credit for like you say, for coming out, not being afraid, and for taking the flack, and it not being scared to do so. But within the government in Canada and that, we have seen recently that I think it's Larry Maguire from the Parliament recently discussed UAP in front of a committee. I forget, natural resources, maybe. That was something that kind of came out of left field for a lot of people to see someone new in Canada discussing this in such an important role.
Well, let me interrupt you there for a second, Vinny.
Sure.
With respect to Paul Hellyer, I think it was probably 2010, if I'm correct. I spoke with Paul, and this is in reference to getting this into the Canadian government, so to speak.
Right.
And in the context of what's happened just recently with Maguire, it's not the first time. Okay. Paul and I decided to approach the senator in charge of the Defense Committee here in Canada. Okay. Senator Colin Kenny. And we devised a plan where Paul would go up there and try to introduce Colin Kenny as the chair of the Canadian Defense Senate Committee to deal with this issue. And the reason that Paul did it was because that Colin Kenny was at one time Paul Hellyer's campaign manager when he ran in Trinity Bellwoods here in Toronto to become the first, become the youngest member of Parliament to attain that position. And so they were very close friends. So Paul went up to Ottawa and sat in Colin Kenny's office. And he had been briefed before by Paul by telephone, but he brought all his documentation forward. And as chair of the Defense Committee in the Senate, which is a pretty lofty position, Mr. Hellyer spent a good part of the day presenting his information to Colin Kenny. Okay. And with the hope that he'd bring it forward to the Senate. And after a full day of this, Mr. Kenny, Senator Kenny, just leaned back in his chair and he said, "You know what, Paul? This is too big a fish for me to fry." End of story. So we know that the Senate committee at the time, the chair at least, whether he brought it forward to his colleagues or not, the chair of that committee knew about this information. He had been briefed by Hellyer on it. So the Canadian government has known about this for so long. And when I say government, I'm not meaning people in Parliament, sitting in Parliament. I'm talking about the upper echelons, like Senator Kenny. So from that point of view, now that Maguire has done what he's done, which is a huge break, I must say, this has been going on percolating behind the scenes within the Canadian government for a long, long time.
Yeah. Chrissy or Daniel, anything to say?
Well, yeah, no, I can speak at length of what happened with Mr. Maguire. Just some background on that. Larry Maguire is a member of Parliament for Manitoba, a federal politician. He's a conservative member of Parliament, so that they currently form the opposition to Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party right now. As part of Mr. Maguire's work, he sits on a committee in Parliament called the Natural Resources Committee. Excuse me. And so during committee, they were reviewing budgets, and there was a note in there about nuclear facilities in Canada being given money from the military for security for Canadian nuclear facilities. So Mr. Maguire saw that as an opportunity to raise specific questions about whether or not there have been UAP and security-related cases involving UAP at Canadian nuclear facilities. He posed those questions to the Deputy Minister of Natural Resources. Here in Canada, we have a great deal of uranium mining as well as several nuclear power plants. And they're currently awaiting answers. This request didn't come out of nowhere. I can tell you that I've been in contact with Mr. McGuire's team for some time now. I didn't know that they were doing this in advance, but I was notified, and I guess I was the first one to put that news out there by putting a video clip of him asking those questions in Parliament, and then subsequently his written response. The way politics works here in Canada, there's not a great deal of room for independent voices. Party discipline is very strict. If you look at the United States, you'll see Democratic senators or Republican senators openly disagreeing with members of their own party. That doesn't really happen in Canada. The only way to see any political movement on this in Canada from an opposition member, or really in anyone, is through committee work. So Mr. McGuire has done a great job in raising these questions as they pertain to nuclear facilities in the Natural Resources Committee. I'm still very hopeful that other members of Parliament who sit on defense, intelligence committees, as well as scientific committees will raise similar questions, because that's the only way we're going to be able to get the ball forward. As for Mr. Hellyer, I would like to perhaps provide a bit of a differing perspective. I'm familiar with him and his work and his tireless advocacy, but I not to discredit his memory, but I do believe that some of the conclusions that he was presenting as fact, again, made it very difficult for people who are new to the subject to digest the message he was saying. As Victor said, Mr. Hellyer had come to his conclusions that, Earth was being visited by other beings, and he wasn't afraid of expressing that fact. But I think, as someone who's trying to wield influence, not tailoring your message for the audience is somewhat problematic. And I think it ended up doing a bit of a disservice to his movement. The people I've spoken to and who interacted with him, they respected his advocacy, but at the same time, they wished he didn't push his conclusions. And it should be noted, he came to, as Victor mentioned, he read some material and began researching the subject after his time in office. I think with Mr. McGuire, to see a sitting member of Parliament, stand up and ask the government serious questions about UAP and nuclear security, it's unprecedented. It hasn't happened in Canada in decades, and he should be applauded for being brave and being one of the first ones in office, in Parliament, sitting to do this. And I have reason to believe he's not done asking his questions, and I hope others are going to follow suit.
Yeah, I agree. I hope Mr. McGuire does the same thing and keeps advocating in that space. Myself with Paul Hellyer, I met him through Victor, and I will say, if anything, gentle giant means so well. Wonderful human being, amazing writer, and for sure, maybe some people didn't align with what he thought about, extraterrestrials and how he went about his approach. But I will thank him for being one of the first people to come forward and talk about UFOs within, with being a former Minister of Defense. So that that never happened before. If you believe what he said or not when it comes to other issues with ETs, but he did bring awareness to it, and I thank him for that. And I think he was an amazing man. He's a really, really great man, and he meant well, and he meant to do well. And I think that's what, in my mind, that's what matters. When I was lucky enough to spend some time with him.
Well, I think it's interesting to point out, as far as Mr. McGuire is concerned, and in my conversations with Mr. McGuire's staff, one individual who I spoke with now for 3 times, for the third time, it's come to my attention, and I said this on the radio 2 weeks ago, that I don't think this is Mr. McGuire's doing himself. I've become convinced that someone, one individual particularly, in his office is completely plugged into this issue like no other political staff member that I know. And in my discussions with this individual, I got to interact with this individual on a very specific basis about the background of the information that's going on right now. And I asked several very, very pointed questions. And this individual had all the answers. He's as up to speed, and I don't know how old this individual is. I feel he's a relatively young fellow. And he is completely up to speed with this information. and even to the point of pointing things out to me that I didn't know. Okay. And I am convinced that we have a disclosure advocate within the office of Larry Maguire. They won't come out and say that, but the individual that I spoke to is quite clearly in possession of information, either on his own, through his own research, or through research that he has to the Canadian government. I don't know where he's getting it all, but he's indeed plugged into this issue. And it is beyond me that how Larry Maguire, and correct me if I'm wrong, how Larry Maguire would find out about the Senate Intelligence Committee and their work. Okay, he could have done it on his own, but the importance of it, that's up to somebody else. So I'll repeat it again. Somebody in Mr. Maguire's office is a disclosure advocate. How that happens, how the two rails are going to meet eventually within Parliament, that's going to be up to Mr. Maguire to make those two rails meet. Right now, you've got the Resources Committee moving in one direction, and then you have the Defense Committee and Department of Defense moving in another. And those two rails, as it was explained to me, will never meet, or will meet under very unusual circumstances. What has to happen, and if Mr. Maguire is worth his salt, he will make those two rails converge. And that's up to him right now. That's a very big move that he's going to have to make with the help of the staff member that I spoke to.
Yeah, I also don't think this conversation's done in Canadian politics. Like, it's trickling its way up. So we're going to hear more for sure. Like, I don't think it's going to go away. We just have to wait to see what happens, right? And there might be more people advocating in all different parties that we're not sure of. Because again, like I think a lot of people, even though you're with a political party, you might find UFOs interesting, and you've been always curious. And now that the mainstream media has kind of welcomed it and American politics have welcomed it, you might see Canadian politics following in suit, because it feels that there is some, the ridicule is left behind a little bit. So I think we'll see more of it, but for sure, I think politically, both sides are probably looking at it more than we would imagine.
Does anyone know if John Hannaford has produced a response to Larry Maguire's letter?
Yes, they produced a response to his verbal questions, but not a response to the written letter itself. I can also throw out there that there is a degree of awareness of current events at some of the highest levels of the Canadian government. And I very much hope to be sharing that in a story with you, hopefully within the month.
Wow, that's impressive. Now, that kind of leads me on to what you've been doing. I know that's.
Yeah, but there's an awareness because listen, members of government watch CNN. They saw the news about the ODNI report, and there was a desire to get up to speed. And I guess I'll leave it there.
Well, that's really promising.
There has been briefings too. There's been briefings too from American to Canadian. About UFOs. We know that there's been briefings on both sides, from Americans to Canadians.
Well, I know that six members of Congress, six members of the not Congress, but 6 members of the Parliament have been briefed by people in the States.
And I think that there's, for sure, I would not be surprised. We know that that's been going on. I think even just before the preliminary assessment report, it was happening. We are sistering countries. We're going to talk. UK, we're probably talking to UK more than we'd even imagine about this topic as well. So we're all connected in the Western world. So our political systems are having conversations. Canada was run up to speed probably a little bit later than it should be. And Canadian media is just really lacking around telling the story, but it will change, it will change. And there will be some other forms of advocacy that will happen. And, we'll slowly see it progress, but that's very Canadian. It's very Canadian for media to pick it up and the topic to be very, very slow. So I'm not holding my breath for anything to happen like right away, but it will happen over time.
It definitely mirrors what's happening here in the UK. We always follow suit after the US has done something. We just follow. We don't match them. We're always behind. It sounds like Canada and even Australia are very much in similar levels, let's say. But Daniel, recently you obviously broke this big story that you'd received, was it hundreds of documents, 20 plus years Was there anything in there? I mean, sorry, let me just backtrack. Would you be able to just tell us how that came about, how you got them, and any findings that were positive about what we can expect going forward?
Yeah, a little background on that story. So just over a year ago, I filed what we call in Canada an access to information request, FOIA, Freedom of Information in the US. I filed an access to information request asking for 2 decades worth of UAP related material from the Federal Transportation Authority, which oversees all aviation in the country. So, the first time I asked, they got back to me and said that they didn't have it. And then, I just kept asking for the documents in different ways, posing more specific questions, learning the structure of the organization and targeting specific offices within it. And then lo and behold, through 2 separate access to information requests, we were able to obtain 290 pages of reports, which can, within there were UFO reports from commercial pilots, a few from military personnel, police officers, a lot of civilian sightings that have been made to aviation officials as well. And I guess that's it. So, I wrote a story about the sort of greatest hits in there. Some of that stuff in there isn't going to be new to people who've been following Canadian developments very closely. But I think for general audiences to see this, huge volume of material, 20 years worth of UFO reports from transportation officials, it's significant. It's not every report the Canadian government has. I've been able to identify other, UAP reports held by transportation officials, but that were given different categories in their reporting system. There's also military reports that aren't part of this, but this 290 pages gives you a really good snapshot of the types of things, particularly commercial aviators have been reporting over Canada in the past 2 decades. And it's, reports from coast to coast. It's solid objects, it's lights, it's things just hovering, it's things moving erratically. It's really the, things that are huge, things that are small. It's just the sort of whole gamut of, unusual experiences. Of all of them, I think the one that stood out for me the most, I have it right in front of me right here, is from December 2018. There's a very famous Canadian case from a place called Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia, from October 1967, where multiple witnesses observed a luminous object disappearing into the ocean. Well, just, really, really close to there was on December 2018, there was a fisherman in the Bay of Fundy and a woman at home in Nova Scotia who both separately contacted a search and rescue center in the city of Halifax to report a glowing object hovering high out over the ocean. The search and rescue department contacted a Canadian Air Force squadron that's affiliated with NORAD, which is the joint Canada-US group that, defends North American airspace and et cetera. So they contacted this squadron and they did a review of NORAD radar. And lo and behold, NORAD radar picked up a object that correlated almost exactly to the time and location of the sighting, which lasted over half an hour. And they, most of the reports in this release, usually there's just a few lines of details. This one was, a full report with lots of paragraphs explaining how they couldn't understand how they could get a radar hit that suddenly appeared nearly 12,000 feet above the ocean, hung out there for 40 odd minutes, and then just disappeared. They were left stumped. Their report, which is included in the story in the release, you can read it yourself. They say their best guess was weather, but they didn't know. And I thought that one was interesting because it's not too often that I'm finding UAP, UFO sightings that, multiple witnesses, and then it's being corroborated by military sensors. So, and then the proximity to Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia, anecdotally, I thought was quite interesting too. So I guess that's one of the ones that stood out for me. But I think overall, it's just the volume of reports, the fact that, there's 2 decades of pilots seeing strange things over Canada. At least for me, I'm not the guy with conclusions, but it reinforces for me that there's a mystery there worth investigating.
Well, I think it's more than a mystery, Daniel. I think that the whole Shag Harbor incident back in 1967 was extremely delicate in the way it was handled by the RCMP. With the number of people within the RCMP that cataloged information about it, and with those RCMP officers who actually witnessed the lights in the sky. Now, what most people don't know about that incident is that huge expenditure of time and energy and money was expended on getting Navy divers to go down below the surface of the water to investigate the nature of what might have happened under the water. On top of the water, some of the craft were seen to be hovering over the water. Some disappeared into the horizon, but they left behind a yellow foam of some kind. And that seems to be part of the whole enigma about this. And that's where the divers began to dive. And I won't even get into what they may have seen down there, which is another story altogether. However, the interesting part of this particular story is one Navy diver and another female witness to this incident. Both of them subsequently were called to the office of Curtis LeMay. I don't know if you know who Curtis LeMay was, but he was a famous and very, very powerful American general during the Second World War, responsible for developing strategic places where bombs could be deployed. And he was a major instigator of a lot of aggression within the military. Barry Goldwater had an opportunity to meet with him, but I'll get into that in a moment. In any case, this diver and the witness, the daughter of the diver, were called to the office of Curtis LeMay and brought into the office, and both of them were sat down and told that they were never to utter any information about Shag Harbor ever again. And he was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And I'm investigating this with the witness. We're hoping that the father of this witness may come forward, but I know for sure that the individual woman who was in fact a witness will be coming forward very soon. And I'll be talking to her and finding out whether or not we can go forward with this in a meaningful way. So it's a very interesting twist to this story.
Well, get him now. It's definitely one of the most important and documented mass sightings in Canadian history. And because it occurred in 1967, Victor, I wish you all the luck. You know, the clock is ticking. Some of those folks might be getting on in years. We get those testimonies, sir. I have all the faith in you.
I would give Chris Rakowski a call when you can. And with that said about him too, like he was the one that collected all of these reports for years to come. And I think Daniel, we talked about this in the interview I did with you too, that he's not doing it anymore, that the government's not giving him reports. Okay, Vinny, I'm going to ask if it's okay. Ask a question to Daniel. I forget, where are they putting the reports now? Where are they being filed since Chris isn't doing it? I can't remember.
Some background for those who don't know. Chris Rakowski is a Winnipeg, Manitoba-based ufologist. He's been engaged in the topic for 30, 40 years. His, lots of articles, he's written lots of books, and one of his biggest contributions is every year he produces a survey that collects, he tries to basically collect and collate all UFO sightings from a variety of sources that happen every year. It's like thousands of cases every year. Starting in the late 90s or early 2000s, just after, as I mentioned previously, the National Research Council of Canada used to receive UFO reports from various parts of the government and military. Well, when they stopped doing that, Chris knew people there, and he asked them, well, if you're not going to be taking these reports, I'll take them. The way he describes it, years later, he received a call from someone in the military confirming that he was the guy who still wanted to receive the reports, and thus started a 2-decade relationship where he was receiving UFO reports directly from the Canadian military and directly from Transport Canada, which is the federal transportation department that I received those 290 pages of reports from. By his own admission, he didn't receive all the reports. There's certain ones, for example, if NORAD radar picks up something and there's a clear defense nexus, those weren't being handed to him, but he was being sent unredacted reports from pilots, citizens, police officers, etc. And the data from those reports was being used in his annual survey. The way, as I understand it, in 2021, just last year, amidst heightened scrutiny of the subject, Transport Canada stopped sending him this. And when I asked them questions about it, they sent a very offensive and dismissive email to me saying that they had only supplied these reports to Chris as a courtesy for his fiction research. You know, that's how their public affairs department structured
Come
this.
on, guys.
So,
It's a horrible PR response.
So he's been
So
cut
bad.
off. It's unclear what his stance is with the military. I asked the military point blank, and they say their procedures, you know, there's specific procedural documents I found from our Air Force that says, you know, forward these to Chris. They say those still stand. The way, you know, you'd have to ask that question to Chris, but my understanding is, you know, since about 6 months to a year ago, he stopped receiving the data, that the taps have run dry. So we're in this unfortunate situation in Canada now where, you know, when data is coming in, it's just collecting dust as far as we know, because we still see, you know, reports are still being made. You know, the access to information requests are revealing that. But, you know, now there's no like public person, there's no person who's getting this. So it's difficult. You know, when I'm talking to people in Ottawa and people in government, I'm constantly advocating for two things. One, that Canada continues to view this as a scientific issue and not a military issue. Because the second, it's viewed as a defense issue in Canada. All the types of data I've been able to pull through our access to information request system, suddenly they can just withhold that on national security grounds. It's the same in the US. You can get a comment from a US senator about UAP, but you're gonna have a very hard time finding any case data because it's all withheld on national security grounds. So I give that one message that, you know, we need to keep this scientific perspective. And two, I think Canada needs to revive some sort of situation where these reports, you know, are redacted, where personal information is redacted, but then it's being put out there so, you know, researchers and scientists and anyone who's interested in the subject, you know, can access it. So I'm actively advocating for that. I'm a huge proponent of data transparency. And, you know, if anyone who's listening, you know, is in government or is a Canadian and wants to write their member of parliament, you know, we really need to advocate for more and better data and more transparency, because as it stands now, Chris isn't getting it. You know, there's no research institution getting it. It's going to be complete silence, and we want more and better data, right? So I think something has to change.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, listen, before we finish up, we just hit the hour mark, but before we finish up, do you feel like I've missed anything when it comes to talking about the relationship between Canada and UFOs? Was anything?
God, we could talk about stories forever, but I think those are the best. Like, so many. Well, there's a fair amount, but I would say I think we've talked about the most recent stuff. I think it's great. I think it's a really great discussion.
No, that's fantastic. And I really appreciate all of you joining me. And I'd love to invite you all back on separately as a panel again in the future. I know that we can always have some fantastic conversations. But for now, guys, I will just say thank you so much. Thank you to everybody that's been in the live chat watching as well, for everybody that watches afterwards, and for anybody that listens afterwards on the Anomalous Podcast Network. I thank you all so much. I really appreciate all the support. And we'll see you again soon. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.